Tell me, Muse, of the man of many ways, who was driven far journeys after he had sacked Troy's sacred citadel. Many were there whose cities he saw, whose minds he learned of. Many the pains he suffered in his spirit on the wide sea, struggling for his own life and the homecoming of his companions. Even so he could not save his companions, hard though he strove to, they were destroyed by their own wild recklessness. Fools who devoured the oxen of Helios, the sun god, and he took away the day of their homecoming. From some point here, goddess, daughter of Zeus, speak and begin our story. These sentences mark the beginning of the Odyssey, one of the greatest epics ever to be composed in ancient Greece and probably in the entire world. In these few introductory lines, the main topics are already pointed out. The main character of the story is Odysseus. He is one of the heroes of the Trojan War. Also his main desire is mentioned, homecoming. It furthermore becomes clear that he encountered substantial difficulties in fulfilling his desire. Can you all hear me? Yeah, good. Before we can embark on exploring the contents of the story and get better acquainted with its hero, Odysseus, we first have to look at some background information, such as who wrote the story, when was it composed, and what was the society like in the times of Odysseus. The Odyssey was written by the poet Homer in the late 8th century BC. Interestingly, very little is known about Homer. All we know is that he lived in the second half of the 8th century BC in the area around Smyrna, which is today's Izmir on the west coast of Turkey. And he wrote at least one other great epic, the Iliad, which tells a story from the Trojan War. In contrast to many legends which relate that Homer was poor. Oh. Let's take a short break. Welcome back. Okay, in contrast to many legends which relate that Homer was poor and from a low social class, a detailed analysis of the epics themselves clearly show that he was a professional poet associated with the nobility, possibly even of noble origin himself. The high position of a poet at the court in this time is clearly illustrated by the way how Demodocus, the singer of the Phaeacians, is described in Book 8. Both epics, the Iliad as well as the Odyssey, relate to stories from a distant past, which according to Greek belief dated around the year 1200 BC, so 400 years before Homer's time. It is hotly debated among modern scholars how far both epics and especially the story of the Trojan War actually reflect historical truth. But it may be speculated that at least some historical facts may be hidden in the stories. For the ancient Greeks, however, the stories reflected historical reality, so they believed in the existence of the Trojan War. Homer used stories that were already well known in Greece and very likely were orally transmitted already for several centuries. The 8th century in Greece was a heroic age. The society was still dominated by kings who reigned over small regional kingdoms in various parts of Greece. So Odysseus is one of these kings, and the interesting thing is also that the Greeks were not united at this time. The Trojan War, actually, where they unite against a common enemy, is an exception. Most of the cases, they spent the time fighting each other. Writing had only recently been introduced to Greece from the Near East, that is, from this region, from Phoenicia. Thus, it is quite astonishing to have lengthy epics of a high literary quality, such as the Iliad and the Odyssey, as the first literary products of Greece. In fact, one of the earliest inscriptions in Greek from the end of the 8th century BC contains a reference to Homer's Iliad. So that's what we see here on this slide, a drinking vessel which refers to a drinking cup that belonged to King Nestor, who is one of the kings, the Greek kings, that features prominently in the Iliad. Literacy in Greece thus started with what we could call a big bang. Epics themselves, of course, have a longer history in Greece. An epic is a heroic story mixing real, that is, historical, and fictional elements, such, for instance, the appearance of gods and monsters in the story. Poets and bards sang these epics at the courts of kings and nobles, firstly for entertainment, but more importantly, to transmit values of the society to the audience. These epics, as I already said, were transmitted orally for a very long time. Thus, the contents were already known by most people. Homer, therefore, did not need to tell the whole story of the Trojan War and the homecoming of the heroes, but he could focus on the most dramatic aspects. For the sake of clarity, first the correct chronological order of the events will be summed up. As should be clear by now, the Odyssey takes its name from its hero, Odysseus. Odysseus is the king of Ithaca, a small island on the west coast of Greece. For 10 years, he fought in the Trojan War. Odysseus actually figures as one of the more important heroes in Homer's Iliad, which tells an episode from the Trojan War. It was he who constructed the wooden horse, by which the Greeks finally managed to conquer Troy after having it put to a 10 years siege. The Odyssey starts after the conquest of Troy. It tells the story of Odysseus' homecoming. After Odysseus had left Troy, he planned directly to sail back to his home on Ithaca with all his men and the spoils of war he had gained when sacking Troy. However, storms and various adventures prevented him from coming home, and during these wanderings, which lasted for another 10 years, he lost all his ships and his companions. The reasons for his misfortunes are mainly due to the wrath of Poseidon, the god of the sea, whose son Polyphemus, the Cyclops, Odysseus had blinded. It has to be pointed out here already that Odysseus had no intention to offend the gods. He only blinded the Cyclops to save his own life. We will come back to this point later in this lecture. Lastly, Odysseus alone arrived on the island of the nymph Calypso, who fell in love with him and wanted to marry him. Odysseus, however, was still determined to return home, and at last built a raft on which he managed to reach the island of Scheria, where the Phaeacians lived. He received a hearty welcome there, and after having spent some time as a guest of King Alkinoos, he was brought by the Phaeacians back to his own island of Ithaca. However, as Odysseus, upon his return, had no idea what was going on in his own home. Remember, he had been away for 20 years. On the advice of the goddess Athena, he disguised himself as a beggar to find out about the situation on Ithaca. He first stayed with Eumaeus, his own swineherd, who informed him about the general situation. Odysseus kept his disguise and only lifted it when he met his own son Telemachus. Telemachus, by now a young man of 20 years, brought Odysseus to the palace, where again he went in disguise of a beggar. There he finds out how the suitors, young noblemen from Ithaca, abuse the concept of hospitality, and he himself is actually being humiliated by them. When his wife Penelope interviews him, he tells her a false story of his fate. The story comes to its climax when Penelope proposes a contest for the suitors, in which they are to string Odysseus' bow and shoot an arrow through the shaft holes of 12 axes which have been arranged in a row. She then proposes to marry the winner of this contest. Not surprisingly, none of the suitors can even string the bow, and in the end, only Odysseus is able to fulfill the task. He now finally reveals himself, and together with his son Telemachus and the help of the goddess Athena, kills all the suitors. Interestingly, Penelope still remains cautious, and before finally accepting that Odysseus has really returned, puts him to a last test when asking him about the special features of the bed in his own bedchamber. The point is here that Odysseus' bed was built around an olive tree that grew in the house, so the bed could not be moved without chopping down the tree. And when Penelope proposes, "Oh, I'll put your bed up in some other room," then Odysseus really gets angry and shouts, "Who cut down the olive tree?" So this is the final proof for Penelope that Odysseus really has returned, because nobody else knows about these special features. The story ends with another fighting scene in which the relatives of the killed suitors seek revenge, but this fight is ended by a peace imposed by Athena. Homer, however, told the story in a slightly different way. As I already pointed out, the contents of the story of Odysseus were already well known in Homer's time, so the poet does not need to tell the events in the correct chronological order. He only focused on the most decisive points of the story. Altogether, in the Odyssey, only a period of 40 actual days is covered, starting from the point when Odysseus is finally allowed to leave the island of Calypso until his re-establishment as the king of Ithaca. Homer's Odyssey is subdivided into 24 chapters, or books as he calls them. Book 1 acts as a kind of prologue, in which, by a council of the gods, Odysseus finally is allowed to return home from the island of Calypso. Books 2 to 4, instead of setting Odysseus on his way home, first tell the story of a journey which Odysseus' son Telemachus undertakes to find out news about his father. These books convey important information, as they explain to the reader the desolated situation in Odysseus' kingdom. Although Odysseus had been away for 20 years by now, his wife, Penelope, still hopes that he will return one day. However, a group of suitors, young noblemen from Ithaca, urge her to forget Odysseus and marry one of them instead. This situation is, of course, bound to create tensions. Will Penelope remain loyal to Odysseus? How will the suitors react should Odysseus eventually return home? And what about Odysseus' son, Telemachus? When Odysseus left, he was a small baby. Now he's a young man of 20 years, so he hardly knows his father. It is only in Book 5 that we actually meet Odysseus and learn how he builds a raft by which he leaves Calypso's island. On his way home to Ithaca, he gets shipwrecked once more, as so often, due to Poseidon's wrath, and barely manages to reach the island of Scheria alive, where the Phaeacians live. In books 6 to 12, Odysseus' stay on the island of Scheria is described, and in books 9 to 12, he actually tells the stories of his wanderings and adventures to the Phaeacians. This order of events is quite important for the story. When we first meet Odysseus on Calypso's island, he is a broken man. He weeps out of desperation. However, by retelling all his adventures to the Phaeacians, he regains his confidence and thus gains the strength to restore order to his own kingdom. From book 13 onwards, Homer's version follows the correct chronological order as detailed above. Can you all hear me without the mic?
Yes.
Yeah. So just to explain what I want to show with this funny diagram here. So the arrow represents time. On top of the arrow, we have the real time, the Trojan War for 10 years, Odysseus' wanderings for another 10 years. On the bottom of the arrow, we have the events as told in our book, the Odyssey. So the actual period covered by the Odyssey are only the last 40 days, not the entire 20 years, but books 9 to 12 are the so-called retrospective, where Odysseus tells all his adventures to the Phaeacians. So that starts with the conquest of Troy, and so the reader gets to know these, let's say, rather fascinating events that Odysseus had. This arrangement, Homer's arrangement of the story, actually reflects the succeeding stages of Odysseus' homecoming. So books 5 to 12 cover Odysseus' wanderings. Books 13 to 16 see Odysseus on his own island, but outside of the palace. In books 17 to 22, the events inside the palace are told, and it is only in book 23 that Odysseus finally reaches his own bedchamber, the innermost part of the palace. It should be noted that Odysseus' wanderings take place outside of the real world. Only the starting point, Troy, and the end point, Ithaca, are places that can securely be located on the map. All other locations of Odysseus' adventures have no secure position in the Mediterranean or elsewhere. And the various attempts by different scholars to identify the names of places in the epic, the island of Scheria, Calypso's island, the island of the Cyclops, and so on, to locate these places, that is no more than guesswork. What is interesting, however, Odysseus several times tells false stories about his wanderings, about his adventures. When he's asked who he is, where he comes from, and so on, he doesn't say, oh, I am Odysseus, and I fought the Cyclops, and I did this, and this, and this. He keeps his disguise, and the interesting thing is that in his, let's say, false stories, all the places he mentions can be located on a map. He claims to have visited the island of Crete, for instance, the region of Phoenicia, the country of Egypt, and so on and so forth. So this is something you may want to discuss in further detail in class, the contrast between, let's say, his real adventures, which take place in an imagined world, and his false stories that take place in the real world. There are certainly many ways how to read the Odyssey. First of all, it is a fascinating adventure story, and without doubt was also understood as such in ancient Greece. However, the story also conveys moral issues important for the ancient Greek society. Let us first take a look at Odysseus, the hero of the story, as, like nowadays, the main characters of these stories always serve as role models for the society in general. As should be clear by now, Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, is the hero of the story. He is characterized by a number of attributes. First of all, he is a hero. He can and does fight if necessary. An example of his superior strength is given in the story of the bow contest in book 21, line 409, where it is said, I quote, "So without any strain, Odysseus strung the great bow," end of quote. And this after all the suitors have unsuccessfully attempted the same thing. Odysseus is a pious man. He always honors the gods. Most important, however, is his intelligence, his resourcefulness. Remember, it was not the brutal strength of Achilles, another Greek hero, that led to the conquest of Troy, but Odysseus' plan of devising a stratagem, the wooden horse, that is mentioned in book 8. It is not only a cleverness helping him to survive, such as in the case of the escape from the cave of the Cyclops, but a genuine curiosity. For instance, Odysseus enters the cave of the Cyclops out of pure curiosity. He does not really need to go there. This is told in book 9, lines 172 and following, where Odysseus tells his men, I quote, "While I go and find out about these people and learn what they are, whether they are savage and violent and without justice, or hospitable to strangers and with minds that are godly," end of quote. Another example is Odysseus' way of interrogating the spirits of the dead in the underworld. Yes, he even visits the underworld during his adventures. Book 11, lines 228 and following, where it is said about Odysseus, or he says himself, "I then thought about a way to question them, the spirits of the dead, to learn from people that are already dead." Again, he just does that to gain knowledge, to satisfy his curiosity, but not for any personal advantages. Odysseus is able to endure suffering to achieve his goals. It is basically the longing for his home and his family that let him endure all his misfortunes. So most important is his determination. He uses all his resources to achieve one goal, coming home to his wife and son. Compared to the motivation of Gilgamesh, the book that we've just read, this seems a somewhat unheroic goal. Gilgamesh strives for fame, for eternal life. Odysseus wants to come home to his wife and his child. Okay. However, this certainly makes Odysseus a more sympathetic character, not only for modern eyes. Odysseus has been called the first modern man by the 20th century philosophers Adorno and Horkheimer. He's not only a hero with strength and courage, most famous he is for his resourcefulness, his ingenuity. As I pointed out, it is not only an ingenuity born out of necessity to survive, but a genuine curiosity. It is the combination of his different attributes, his courage, his ability to endure suffering, but most important, his resourcefulness and curiosity, which truly make him one of the most fascinating Greek heroes. It is especially the latter attributes that actually paved the way to the so-called Greek Enlightenment during the 5th century BC, when philosophers and historians show the same kind of curiosity. You will actually be reading some of these books written by historians and philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and so on, where, well, the same curiosity, the questioning of things is detailed. Further moral issues concern a variety of points. We don't have the time to discuss all of them, but a few should be at least addressed here. A very important question is the concept of fate versus free will. Fate means that things are determined for people. Free will means they can actually, the humans themselves, can decide what to do or what not to do. Interestingly, Homer is somewhat ambiguous when it comes to this question of fate versus free will. Several passages seem to indicate that the fate for humans was set by the gods. For instance, Book 1, lines 16 and 17, where it is said, I quote, "But when in the circling of the years, that very year came in which the gods had spun for him his time of homecoming." End of quote. It seems clear from this passage that Odysseus was fated to wander around for another 10 years after the Trojan War. He could do nothing to change it. On the other hand, there are passages that indicate that the gods often revise their decisions according to the behavior of the humans. So man seems to be at least partly responsible for his fate. Recklessness and wrongdoing will lead to punishment by the gods, or, in the case of the suitors, by Odysseus himself. To make this point clear, let's look at one quote, again from Book 1, lines 6 to 9. I quote, "Even so he could not save his companions, hard though he strove to, they were destroyed by their own wild recklessness, fools who devoured the oxen of Helios, the sun god, and he took away the day of their homecoming." End of quote. The crucial passage here is, they were destroyed by their own wild recklessness. So it was not a fate set by the gods, but it was a foolish act, laying hands on the property of a god, that led to the death of Odysseus' companions. Similarly, we hear it from Zeus, the supreme god himself. Again, this is a quote from Book 1, line 32 and following, where Zeus says to the other gods, I quote, "Oh, for shame, how mortals put the blame upon us gods, for they say evils come from us, but it is they, rather, who by their own recklessness win sorrow beyond what is given." End of quote. So here, again, crucial passage, who by their own recklessness win sorrow beyond what is given. Ideas about proper behavior are expressed on several different occasions. A very important part is the proper treatment of foreigners and guests. Compare, for instance, the correct behavior shown by King Nestor in Book 3, Telemachus, Odysseus' own son, in Book 1, and the Phaeacians towards Odysseus in Book 7, where guests are properly received, they are fed, they receive gifts, and so on. Compare that with the improper behavior of the Cyclops in Book 9, line 250 and following, who instead of treating Odysseus and his companions as guests and serving them food, he starts killing them and eating them. Of course, also the guests themselves have obligations. The suitors in Odysseus' palace clearly misbehave. They even insult the lady of the house, Penelope, and other guests such as Odysseus, who is disguised as a beggar, described in Book 17. So why is this proper treatment of foreigners so important? Because foreigners bring news. We're in an era before Twitter, email, and so on and so forth, no radio, no television. So it was travelers who brought news. And for bringing these news, they had to be paid by given food, a place to sleep, and so on and so forth. What in the Odyssey makes human life valuable? Fame is, of course, an important component for any man to establish his position in society. Interestingly, the Odyssey is remarkable for putting less stress on fame gained by heroic deeds in battle. See, for instance, the speech of Achilles in the underworld, in Book 11, line 488 and following. So, just in parenthesis, Achilles was one of the fellow heroes of Odysseus in the Trojan War. He was famed for his strength and so on. He, well, actually chose fame above anything else, but now, after his death, he says, I quote, "O shining Odysseus, never console me for dying. I would rather follow a plough as a thrall," meaning a slave, "to another man, one with no land allotted him and not much to live on, than be a king over all the perished dead." End of quote. So the point here is, as a very young man, Achilles was presented by the gods with a choice. He could have either a short but glorious life, or a very long but completely boring and uneventful life. So, being young, he chose the first option, but now he regrets his choice clearly. So, the Odyssey, interestingly, puts more on fame won at home by leading a proper life with family and friends. This is detailed in Book 19, line 332 and following, where it is said, I quote, "But when a man is blameless himself, and his thoughts are blameless, the friends he has entertained carry his fame widely." End of quote. These lines may be seen as unheroic elements within the society. I already suggested contrast this attitude with one propagated by the Epic of Gilgamesh, where fame through heroic deeds and so on are at the forefront of the story. It has to be emphasized, however, that Odysseus is not portrayed as a peaceful man or even a coward. He can and does fight if necessary, but he's not only praised for his strength and his fighting qualities, but rather for his intelligence and his resourcefulness. In addition, reputation rests on being a just man. See, for instance, Book 4, line 689 and following, where it is said about Odysseus, I quote, "What kind of man Odysseus was among your own parents, how he did no act and spoke no word in his own country that was unfair. And that is the way divine kings have. One will be hateful to a certain man and favor another, but Odysseus was never outrageous to any man." End of quote. Well, but how does this go together with attitudes about the truth? When asked who he is, Odysseus several times embarks on a false story. He does not tell his real name or who he really is. That is, for instance, in books 13, books 14, books 19, and so on. This, of course, he does not do for simple cheating. He's not just playing tricks at people, but he is protecting himself until he finds out more about the situation in his country. It has been noted above that his false stories actually sound more credible than his real wanderings. As in the false stories, no gods and monsters appear, and the places he names actually can all be located on maps. It is also important to note that once Odysseus reveals himself, he does not tell false stories anymore. That's from book 22 onwards. So, the more general attitude towards the truth in the epic is the concept that truth is often hidden. It has to be noted that gods, and also Odysseus himself, often appear in disguise. The moral of the epic in this case certainly is that one should not accept things as they appear to be on first sight, but to seek for a hidden truth. Lying, thus, is not condemned in the epic if it serves a certain purpose. If you just do it because you're mean, that's wrong. But if, in the case of Odysseus, for instance, it serves to protect himself, that is okay. See in this context, for instance, Athena's speech to Odysseus in book 13, line 291 and following, where after Odysseus tells Athena a wrong story, and Athena, being a goddess, clearly realizes that Odysseus is lying, so he addresses Odysseus with the following words. I quote, "You wretch, so devious, never wearing his tricks, then you would not even in your own country give over your ways of deceiving and the thievish tales. They are near to you in your very nature." Okay, maybe that sounds like criticism, but she continues. "But come, let us talk no more of this, for you and I both know sharp practice, since you are far the best of all mortal men for counsel and stories, and I among all the divinities am famous for wit and sharpness." End of quote. So instead of condemning Odysseus for his lying stories, she actually compares Odysseus to herself. She compares a mortal man to herself, a goddess. So that clearly is meant as praise. So what about the role of the gods in this story? What about the relations between men and gods? The ancient Greeks believed in many gods. Besides the main 12 Olympian gods, Zeus, Poseidon, and so on, there was a multitude of minor gods. The nymph Calypso, which we meet in the story, is one of them, for instance. This situation is, of course, bound to create problems, as the gods do not always agree with each other. In the Trojan War, for instance, they even openly fight with each other, as some gods support the Trojan side, whereas others favor the Greeks. The gods in the Odyssey are all described with human characteristics. They quarrel, they are greedy, they're sometimes even unjust. Poseidon's hatred towards Odysseus clearly is a case of unjust behavior. Poseidon's wrath is purely based on personal motives, as Odysseus blinded his son, the Cyclops. It is not a case of punishing Odysseus for unjust or immoral behavior. Thus, not all the gods are portrayed as higher moral authorities in this epic. Quite interesting. It is only Zeus, the supreme god, who clearly stands out as representing the principles of justice. The only aspects that therefore distinguish the gods from humans are their superhuman powers and the fact that gods are immortal. The gods do not only watch humans from far away, but they actively engage themselves in human affairs, sometimes in a negative way, for instance, Poseidon shattering Odysseus' raft in Book 5, or in a positive way, Athena advising and protecting Odysseus, even making plans together with him in Book 13. The gods are part of human life and are portrayed by humans according to their own image. So, not God created humans in his image, but here it can be turned the other way around. Humans imagine the gods just as humans themselves are. Nevertheless, it is made explicitly clear in the epic that the gods need to be honored. You cannot just say, oh yeah, they're not behaving well, so I can disregard them. Odysseus is described as a pious man by Zeus himself. Take, for instance, Book 1, line 65 and following, where Zeus says about Odysseus, I quote, "How could I forget Odysseus, the godlike, he who is beyond all other men in mind, and who beyond others has given sacrifice to the gods who hold wide heaven." End of quote. Finally, the story of the Cyclops, which is told in Book 9, which is certainly one of the key events in the first 12 books, will be discussed here in some more detail to illuminate some of the key concepts of the Odyssey. When looking at the description of the way of life of the Cyclopes, we obtain a clear idea of the Greek concept of civilization in contrast to barbarity. The Cyclopes lack all the essential features the Greek associated with civilization. The Cyclopes have no agriculture, they live in caves instead of proper houses, they have no laws, they have no council meetings, they are not fearing the gods, and they don't respect the law of hospitality. So this negative list brings out what the Greeks associated with civilization, namely exactly the opposite. Furthermore, this story brings out the main characteristics of Odysseus. It is first of all Odysseus' curiosity which brings him and his companions into a terribly dangerous situation. On the other hand, through his cleverness and courage, Odysseus manages to rescue them again. The story is the following. Odysseus and some of his men enter the cave of the Cyclops. When he's not there, when the Cyclops returns, he closes the cave with a huge stone, far too heavy for Odysseus and his men to move. And then, one by one, he starts catching Odysseus' men and killing them and eating them, actually. So this presents a problem. If Odysseus and his men fight and kill the Cyclops, they're still trapped in the cave. They cannot open it. So what do? Odysseus proposes to make the Cyclops drunk, and while he's drunk, they blind him. They poke out his one eye. Cyclops is characterized by having only one eye. So The blind Cyclops still can open the cave, but he can't see Odysseus and his companions anymore. And the point is, the Cyclops has his sheep in the cave. The sheep need to go out at some point for grazing, and Odysseus and his men hide under the belly of the sheep and thus can leave the cave. Lastly, this story clearly illustrates the concept of being a hero. When first asked for his name by the Cyclops, Odysseus gives the rather enigmatic answer that his name was Nobody. Why that? This rather curious response is explained only when, after having blinded the Cyclops calls for help from his fellow Cyclopes. When these other Cyclopes rush to our Cyclops cave and ask what's the problem, our Cyclops tells them, "Oh, nobody has blinded me." And the other Cyclopes return to their cave saying, "Oh, maybe it was just a nightmare," and so on. So, with this clever answer, Odysseus has saved himself and his companions once more. While this clever trick saved Odysseus and his companions from the other Cyclopes, it unfortunately is at odds with the concept of heroism. A hero needs his proper name to be associated with his deeds. He needs the fame. It's not good enough if people later on tell, "Oh yeah, there was somebody, I don't know his name, he did really good things." No. The proper name has to be associated with these deeds. It is for this reason, not just for pure recklessness, that Odysseus, once he has escaped from the cave, announces his proper name to the Cyclops. The tragic irony of this fact is that the Cyclops now has the personal details of his adversary. He knows who he is, he knows where he lives, and so on, and asks his father Poseidon to punish Odysseus. As we learn from the story, Odysseus will have to pay a heavy price for this, and he will have to use all his courage and intelligence to escape Poseidon's wrath. But that is something you will hopefully hear about in the next lecture next week. So that's it. Thank you.